So I think this is where an important distinction needs to be made between Pokemon as a franchise and the Pokemon trading card game market. And although both have been around for less than 30 years, Pokemon as a franchise has benefited from some unique advantages that no other collectible in history can really boast of. Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics, reminding you that the classics never go out of style. The question of today's video is the Pokemon TCG an established collectible? Now recently, I was browsing through a number of different articles on E4, and I came across one that I found really fascinating. Now this article was written by TCG Cross Collector and addressed the idea of the different stages of a collectible's life cycle, as well as some of the different metrics that help measure and differentiate one stage from another. I think it's fair to say we've seen some collectibles start out strong, but eventually fizzle out and become just another passing fad or trend, while other collectibles have withstood the test of time and become something truly multi-generational. So what are the different metrics that make that up? Well, I'll do my best to summarize in the article, but I think there's really 3 different metrics that help define and differentiate these stages. One is a collectible's duration, how long has it been around? 2 is the market behavior surrounding that collectible. And then finally, the overall focus of the collectors within that space. Now, before we peel back the layer of each of those individual metrics, I think it's important to first establish what those 3 stages of collectibles are. The first one is the speculative stage, and then the second one is the established stage, and then finally, certain collectibles that do withstand that test of time enter that maturity stage. Anyway, we'll break down each of these 3 and see how they relate specifically to Pokemon. The first stage is the speculative stage of a collectible. Now, traditionally, this is defined as any collectible that's been around for fewer than 30 years. And that time, that longevity is necessary to actually prove that the collectible is sustainable rather than just being another passing fad or another passing trend. Because often I think we do see that where a collectible will come in, hit the market with some initial hype and popularity before eventually the masses move on, the popularity, the trends move on and phase out to something different. We also need to consider the market behavior. Now, as a speculative collectible, it is inherently volatile, and you're going to see that in the market and in the price action where there are some pumps, some bubbles, some subsequent corrections, especially at the beginning, and for collectibles that don't survive this. It's very common to see that aggressive acceleration and then subsequent collapse in the market cycle. And in some cases, this can actually happen in more than one phase, in more than one cycle. Usually though, this is where collectibles go to die, at least as investments are concerned. They never really find their foundation and move beyond that first speculative stage. Finally, we have to consider the collector focus for that particular collectible. Now, because it is in the speculative stage here, it's in the early stages, it is a bit opportunistic. Those that are early adopters, early investors, are taking a higher risk, but are also often privy to a higher reward. I also think this is a place where we see whether a collectible is defined by genuine interest that's going to last, or if it's just that social conformity of people jumping on the bandwagon and supporting something that otherwise they probably don't have any authentic interest in. At stage 2 is the established collectible. Now these are defined as collectibles that have been around for between 30 and 50 years, and by having that sort of staying power, that longer duration of at least a few generations, it shows that it's enduring interest that channels it, not just another fad or a trend and that social conformity driving the interest. In terms of market behavior, we still may see some of that volatility that exists under a speculative collectible. However, we're starting to see some consistent trends emerging, and this can apply to both collectors and the overall market in terms of defined areas of interest and certain niches surrounding the collectible that are established, or maybe certain fundamentals or criteria for determining value that are established, or even past sales data or other metrics for measuring value that are established. In terms of collector focus, this is also the stage where we see a lot of that infrastructure come into play, those secondary spheres of the market, buying and selling platforms, research and market publications, common interest communities, and events and conventions, all those different places for connecting and interacting with the broader hobby surrounding that collectible. It's no longer just the collectible being the focus, but again, it's that larger framework to navigate the collectible and to associate with others who also enjoy it. Then finally, we have stage 3, the mature collectible. Now these are collectibles that have withstood the test of time, lasting for at least 50 years, proving that they're multi-generational and that their interest isn't limited to just the collectible itself, or even the original intended audience for the collectible, but that it has some staying power, some lasting significance likely derived from its cultural or historical impact. In terms of market behavior, this is also where we generally see much more predictability rather than the type of price volatility seen in the earlier stages of a collectible. That's not to say that it's price appreciation or price growth. In fact, often as a collectible ages or matures, the buyer pool diminishes, and so too can some of the prices. However, whether it's price appreciation or price decay, usually it's done in more incremental fashion. This is also where we typically see a clear hierarchy of value established, whether it's for individual items or entire category of items. That's because supply and demand has had that time to establish itself. Finally, in terms of a collector focus, this is usually where we see history and cultural significance up front and center. This is what makes an item multi-generational, is it has something more than just its original intended purpose. It has some sort of larger lasting contribution or story behind it. I think this is why the fundamentals are so important, especially in long-term collecting, as this is often what derives value to those collectibles. So what stage is Pokemon collecting in? Well, that's where we'll turn our attention next. Personally, I would argue that these three metrics, time, market behavior, and collector focus, aren't always perfectly aligned with one another, and that Pokemon actually benefits from several unique advantages that most other collectibles don't, and never have. Still, let's take a look at how each of these applies to Pokemon. In terms of time, Pokemon would have to be considered a speculative collectible. That's because Pokemon is only 27 years old, and that's measuring it back to its earliest foundations, back when the video games were released in Japan in 1996. If we use the US anime release in 1998, that would still put Pokemon at only 25 years old. However, the card game didn't really go mainstream until 1999 at the earliest, making a 24-year history, which is still well short of the 30 years that is in our definition of what is an established collectible. Market behavior is a much trickier metric to assess. However, I would personally consider Pokemon to be an established collectible based on this metric. And while there is a lot of volatility still rocking the market to this day, Pokemon has withstood several major market cycles of this nature, and each time it's grown its base, its foundation, becoming stronger than it was before. We've seen this a number of different times, including 1999 with the initial release of the TCG, which came off with tremendous fanfare before nearly collapsing in entirety. In 2016, we saw this with Pokemon Go, where the world was never more united and humanity closer to world peace, but also there was this major correction immediately after that. Then finally in 2020, with the pandemic and with Pokemon's 25th anniversary, card prices exploded before retracing and trying to reestablish themselves. Basically, I think we've seen a lot of shifting interests and price swings, but the sheer volume of sales and the relative stability that we've seen in most segments of the market is something worth acknowledging, and I think we are seeing Pokemon at least establishing itself with regard to market behavior. Then finally, with regard to collector focus, I'd have to consider Pokemon to be an established collectible based on the amount of attention given to community and market infrastructure at this point in its lifespan. Unlike so many speculative collectibles, there's a whole ecosystem surrounding and supporting Pokemon. You have events and competitions like the World Championships or Collecticon, appealing to both players as well as collectors. There's a number of selling platforms like eBay, TCG Player, and a whole host of auction sites for buying and selling cards. Finally, you have a number of social communities that appeal to the entertainment side, as well as the research and informational side of collecting. There's just so much infrastructure out there that I have to consider Pokemon to be an established collectible. So I think this is where an important distinction needs to be made between Pokemon as a franchise and the Pokemon trading card game market. And although both have been around for less than 30 years, Pokemon as a franchise has benefited from some unique advantages that no other collectible in history can really boast of. One, the elephant in the room that needs to be acknowledged, is that Pokemon is the highest grossing media franchise in the world at $92 billion. It's also multi-generational and has a global reach. In fact, as of the making of this video, Pokemon's translated into 14 different languages, with simplified Chinese being the most recent of those. It's also distributed all over the world. There's virtually no country where you can't get access to Pokemon cards in some way, shape, or form. There's also the diversification that's worth mentioning. You've got a franchise that has a successful trading card game, highly successful video game series, an anime that's been around for over 2 decades, and more merchandise than anybody would ever know what to do with. Historically speaking, this just isn't typical for a collectible at this phase of its life cycle. So we have to credit Pokemon with being ahead of the curve and acknowledge that it is well established as a franchise. On the other hand, the Pokemon TCG market is very much still establishing as it faces some unique changes. We have sealed product investing being done in mass, massive print runs of modern Pokemon cards that have never been seen before. Graded cards are rising in prominence at the same time that population reports are still in flux. Social media, which in and of itself is a relatively new phenomenon, and influencers that are specific to the Pokemon space. We have a number of new market platforms to buy and sell cards, and a whole host of events that are still relatively new. All of these factors are relatively new phenomena, and although they are driven by interest and demand, it will take a while for everything to settle and for established values to truly come into focus. It's kind of like shaking a snow globe. Eventually, everything will settle, and that brings me to my final thought, the future. Pokemon is thriving as a collectible, and the current volatility is really more of a sign that the market infrastructure is establishing itself, and with it a consistent set of fundamentals to help guide that market. Like most established collectibles, as Pokemon matures, I expect it to increasingly focus on the historical impact and the cultural significance that Pokemon has had, and to see this reflected in the maturing of those market fundamentals. Rarity, scarcity, condition, popularity, and history will come to define items that have lasting value and demand long into the future. After all, that is the beauty of collecting in the first place, is that collectibles tell a story. They elicit emotions. And I believe that Pokemon will continue to do both of those things long into the future. Of course, those are just my thoughts, and I eagerly await your own down in the comments below. So what do you think? What stage of a collectible's life cycle do you think Pokemon is in? And do you agree with the metrics used to differentiate each one of these stages? Finally, how do you think Pokemon will fare into the future as an investable collectible? Anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this one. I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you that the classics never go out of style. Thanks for joining me with this video today, and we'll see you with the next one. Till then, stay safe, stay well, have fun, and don't forget to enjoy collecting. Bye, everybody.